silence would have been a mercy. But when my sister pointed at me and called me a failure in front of 300 of Chicago's elite, the ballroom didn't go silent. It laughed. Crystal flutes chimed under the golden chandeliers. A string quartet played something horribly expensive, and I stood there holding a silver tray of champagne like a servant in my own family. Victoria lifted her glass, flashing that practiced, predatory smile, and declared me living proof that effort without pedigree leads nowhere. A quiet chuckle rippled from the front row. Then another. Suddenly, the amusement infected the room like a virus waiting for permission. I felt the heavy tray pressing into my palms, steady, grounded, as a stranger leaned over to his wife, whispering while sizing me up like a cautionary tale. Near the podium, my father offered a light, enabling chuckle to the crowd. My mother just smiled politely. In the Carter family, silence wasn't neutrality. It was an execution. "There's always one in every family." Victoria's voice floated through the microphone, light enough to masquerade as a joke. The energy in the room had shifted, magnetically drawn to her. 39, senior executive, the golden child. In ours, it's my sister Claire, a gentle reminder to you all that hard work alone doesn't guarantee a seat at the table. She turned fully toward me, her eyes dead and cold despite the bright, flawless smile. "Claire, darling, why don't you help the catering staff in the kitchen? At least you can contribute something to the evening." I didn't flinch. I didn't defend myself. I had learned long ago that reacting fed her ego, while silence built a fortress they couldn't breach. I gave a single, slow nod, set my glass down, and walked toward the kitchen without a word. The kitchen was a sensory shock, sweltering, loud, and brutally honest. I traded the ballroom's gilded cruelty for the chaotic rhythm of the prep stations. No expectations here, no comparisons, just work. But before I could pick up another tray, my phone vibrated against my thigh. I pulled it out. The screen illuminated the dim corner. Subject: Executive Termination Notice. Immediate effect. I didn't just read it, I devoured it. The entire executive board of Victoria's firm terminated. A catastrophic string of concealed financial failures, unsealed and heading for the press by midnight. Public announcement pending. The clatter of porcelain and shouting chefs faded into a dull, distant hum. I read the severance details, the fraud implications, the sheer, unadulterated ruin. Then, I locked my screen. Out in the ballroom, a fresh wave of applause erupted. Victoria's voice soared over it, dripping with the arrogance of a woman who thought she owned the world. Her illusion was flawless, untouchable. I picked up a fresh tray of drinks and pushed back through the swinging doors, stepping into the glaring light. I floated through the crowd, offering champagne to men who didn't look at my face and women who thanked me like a ghost. Why wouldn't they? I was just the punchline. I looked across the room at Victoria, basking in the adoration of 100 investors who were currently bleeding money they didn't yet know they had lost. For the first time in my life, looking at her didn't trigger a spark of anger or a desperate need to prove my worth. I felt nothing but crystalline, terrifying clarity. I set the tray gently on a linen-draped table. I didn't say goodbye to my parents. I didn't storm out to cause a scene. I simply picked up my coat and walked out into the biting Chicago night. Behind me, the symphony of their ignorance played on. They thought I was running away, shattered by the humiliation. I let them believe it. Because the most lethal move you can make in a game of chess isn't flipping the board. It's walking away, knowing you've already delivered the checkmate. The drive home that night felt quieter than it should have. The city lights stretched across the windshield in long, blurred lines, softened by a thin layer of rain, and for once I didn't replay what had happened at the party. I didn't need to. Victoria's voice, the laughter, the way my name had been reduced to something small and manageable, none of it was new. It was just a more polished version of something that had always been there. I had been the invisible daughter long before I became the failure. When I was 22, I was the one sitting at the kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of overdue bills while my parents argued in the next room about how everything had gone wrong. Victoria had been in New York at the time, posting photos from rooftop events and industry mixers, already building the image of success that would later define her. No one asked her to come back. No one expected her to. I was the one who stayed. I remember the night my father placed a set of documents in front of me, his tone calm in a way that suggested the decision had already been made. He told me it was temporary, just a restructuring of debt to keep the house, nothing complicated. He said my name would make things easier. He said family helps family. I signed, not because I didn't understand what I was agreeing to, but because I still believed that being useful would eventually make me matter. What I didn't understand then was that usefulness in our family wasn't a phase. It was a role. Over the next few years, I worked quietly, consistently, handling things that were never supposed to be mine. I negotiated with banks, learned how to restructure payments, tracked expenses down to the smallest detail. I paid off debts that no one acknowledged, stabilized a situation no one talked about, and kept everything functioning while my parents told people that Victoria was the one who would take us forward. I never corrected them. At some point, I stopped expecting recognition and started paying attention to something else: patterns. The first time I realized I didn't need them anymore wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no confrontation, no moment where everything broke at once. It was a quiet afternoon in a small office I had rented under a name my family wouldn't recognize, in a part of Chicago they had never visited. I was reviewing a failing company's financials, tracing the same inconsistencies I had seen in my own family's situation years earlier. Overconfidence, poor risk management, decisions made for appearance instead of sustainability. It was all the same. That was the moment everything shifted. Not because I suddenly became successful, but because I understood something clearly for the first time. Companies didn't collapse because of one bad decision. They collapsed because the same type of decision was made repeatedly by people who believed they were too capable to be wrong. I built my strategy around that. I didn't create something visible. I didn't chase recognition or position myself publicly. I built a system that operated quietly, acquiring distressed companies through intermediaries, restructuring them from the inside, and exiting before anyone connected the pattern. No interviews, no press, no public identity, just results. While Victoria was being introduced as a rising executive, I had already completed multiple acquisitions, each one teaching me something new about control, timing, and leverage. I learned how to read people the same way I read financial reports, identifying where pressure would expose weaknesses, where confidence would override caution. And I kept my name out of all of it. Because anonymity wasn't a disadvantage, it was leverage. Back in my apartment that night, I placed my phone on the counter and poured a glass of water, the sound of rain tapping lightly against the window. The email was still there, unchanged, as if reopening it might reveal something different. It didn't. Victoria's company hadn't just made a mistake. It had followed a pattern I recognized immediately: expansion without stability, decisions driven by perception instead of data, a leadership structure that rewarded confidence more than accuracy. I had seen it before. I had fixed it before. The only difference now was personal. My phone lit up with a message from my mother. "Your sister had a difficult night. You should try to be more supportive." I read it, then set the phone down without replying. Supportive. The word felt almost detached from reality. I walked over to my laptop, opened it, and logged into a system that existed entirely outside the world my family understood. Within seconds, the dashboard loaded. Live financial feeds, acquisition alerts, internal reports from analysts who had never met me in person. At the top of the screen was a flagged notification. The same company. Victoria's company. Its valuation was already dropping faster than expected. Market confidence was weakening. Early indicators suggested that buyers would begin circling within days. I sat down, my hands resting lightly on the keyboard. This wasn't about what had happened at the party. It wasn't about what Victoria had said. This was about recognizing an opportunity before anyone else understood its full value. For years, I had kept my work completely separate from my family, not because I was hiding, but because there was no reason to connect the two worlds. They had already decided who I was. Anything that contradicted that would have required them to question themselves. They wouldn't, which was why they never saw me clearly. I clicked into the report, scanning the numbers with the same calm focus I had developed over years of doing this. Debt structure, asset value, operational weaknesses, the kind of details that determined whether something could be saved or whether it should be dismantled. This one could be saved, but not by the people who had led it here. My phone buzzed again, this time with Victoria's name. "I need to talk to you. It's important." I read the message, then locked the screen. For years, I had been the one expected to respond, to adjust, to be available when they needed something. That pattern had already ended. I turned back to the screen, focusing on what mattered. Somewhere across the city, Victoria was trying to understand what had gone wrong, and somewhere between that question and what came next, I was already deciding what would replace it. The news broke before most people had finished their morning coffee. By the time I opened my laptop, the first wave of headlines had already begun to spread, each one carefully worded, carefully incomplete, but clear enough to signal what had happened. Leadership crisis, financial irregularities, immediate restructuring. The language was controlled, but the implications weren't. Victoria's company wasn't stabilizing. It was falling. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't check social media or wait for confirmation from public sources. Instead, I accessed the internal data streams I trusted, the ones that reflected movement before it became narrative. Within minutes, the structure of the collapse revealed itself in numbers rather than headlines. Revenue projections had been overstated for at least 2 quarters. Risk exposure had been flagged internally but dismissed at the executive level. A major expansion strategy, one Victoria had publicly defended, was now draining capital at a rate that couldn't be absorbed. It wasn't a single failure. It was a sequence, and sequences were predictable. I moved through the reports methodically, aligning timelines, identifying decision clusters, tracing outcomes back to their origins. The pattern was consistent. Overconfidence followed by delayed correction. Presentation prioritized over analysis. Momentum used as justification instead of evidence. Then came the confirmation. An internal update, brief and precise. Executive board terminated, effective immediately, including Victoria. I leaned back slightly, letting the information settle into something steady and defined. Not shock, not satisfaction, just clarity. Because this was exactly how organizations collapsed when no one inside them questioned the person leading them. My phone started vibrating a few minutes later. My father's name appeared first, then my mother, then a number I hadn't seen in months, Victoria. I let them all go unanswered. Across the city, the public version of the story was still forming. Analysts were beginning to revise projections. Investors were adjusting expectations. The company's value was already shifting in real time, not based on what had been announced, but on what people understood beneath the surface. Confidence was leaving, and it wasn't coming back. Another message appeared from my mother. "Have you seen the news? Your sister is going through something serious. This is not the time to hold on to old feelings." I read it once, then set the phone aside. Old feelings. That was always the explanation. Not patterns, not decisions, not consequences, just emotions that needed to be managed or dismissed. I stood up and walked toward the window, watching the city move below as if nothing significant had changed. Traffic flowed, people crossed streets, buildings reflected the same light they had the day before. But somewhere inside that movement, something had already shifted. Victoria was no longer operating from a position of control, and for the first time in her life, there was no structure protecting her from the outcome of her own decisions. I returned to my desk and opened a broader market analysis. The internal projections were worse than what the public would see for at least another 24 hours. Liquidity issues were already surfacing. Contract obligations were at risk. Without intervention, the company would move from crisis to collapse in a matter of months. That was the moment it became something else. Not a situation, an opportunity. I expanded the view, identifying potential acquisition paths, mapping out competitors who might attempt to move first. Most would hesitate. The risk was too visible, the timeline too compressed, the uncertainty too high. But that was exactly where leverage existed. Distress created access. Access created control. And control, when applied correctly, created value. I opened a secure channel and sent a brief instruction. Flag Carter Holdings, full analysis. Priority 1. The response came back almost immediately. Already initiated. Of course it was, because while my family was still trying to understand what had happened, I had been watching the indicators long before the collapse became visible. The signals had been there, buried in reports, hidden in decisions that looked reasonable on the surface but didn't hold under pressure. I never relied on surface. Another notification appeared, this time from a private industry network. Speculation had already begun. Potential buyers were being named. Estimated valuations were circulating. Most of them were wrong, not because the numbers were inaccurate, but because the context was incomplete. They didn't understand what the company could become under different leadership. They only saw what it had been. I closed the feed and returned to the core data. Debt structure, asset distribution, operational inefficiencies. Each element aligned into a framework I had seen before, fixed before, rebuilt before. This company wasn't finished. It had just been mismanaged. My phone rang again. Victoria. I watched it for a moment before letting it go. A message followed. I need to talk to you. It's important. I read it, then locked the screen. For years, I had been expected to respond immediately, to adjust my time, my priorities, my attention to fit their needs. That expectation had never been questioned. Until now. I sat back down, focusing fully on the screen in front of me. The data had moved beyond analysis. It was actionable now, structured, defined, ready. Somewhere across the city, Victoria was trying to understand what had gone wrong. And somewhere between that question and whatever came next, I was already deciding what would take its place. By the end of the week, the collapse had a number attached to it. $180 million. That was the figure circulating through private channels, investor calls, and quiet conversations between firms trying to decide whether Carter Holdings was worth the risk. To most of them, it wasn't. The damage was too visible, the timeline too tight, the leadership too unstable. But to me, the number wasn't a warning. It was an opening. I sat in my office early that morning, a space no one in my family had ever seen, high above a part of Chicago they rarely visited. The room was quiet, controlled, built for decisions rather than appearances. Multiple screens lit the wall in front of me, each displaying a different layer of the same situation. Financial projections, legal exposure, acquisition structures, risk models. Carter Holdings was no longer a company. It was a framework waiting to be rebuilt. My team had already completed the first phase of analysis. The report was precise, stripped of speculation, focused only on what could be salvaged and what needed to be removed. The conclusion aligned with what I had seen from the beginning. The company wasn't beyond saving. It had just been led by people who mistook confidence for control. I didn't hesitate. Prepare the acquisition vehicle, I said, my voice steady, the decision already made. Use the Chicago shell structure, no direct attribution. No one questioned it. No one asked if this was personal. Because in this room, decisions weren't measured by emotion. They were measured by outcome. Within hours, the process moved forward. Legal teams were engaged through intermediaries. Financial commitments were layered through structures designed to obscure ownership. The offer was positioned not as a rescue, but as a strategic acquisition. Full control, full authority, no exposure. By the time the board of Carter Holdings received the proposal, my name wasn't anywhere in the documents, exactly where it needed to be. Across the city, the narrative around Victoria had already begun to shift. The same people who had once praised her were now dissecting her decisions, reframing her success through the lens of failure. Industry circles moved quickly. Reputation, I had learned, didn't collapse gradually. It fractured. My phone rang as the final terms were being reviewed. This time I answered. "Claire," my father said, his voice sharper than usual, stripped of the ease he used when he thought he was in control. "We need to talk." I didn't respond immediately. "Your sister's situation is more complicated than we expected," he continued. "There are financial gaps, temporary ones. We may need support until things stabilize." Temporary. Support. The words were chosen carefully, but the pattern behind them hadn't changed. I'm not in a position to help with that, I said calmly. There was a pause, longer than usual. What do you mean you're not in a position? He asked. You've always managed these things. This is family. I glanced at the screen in front of me, at the deal structure that was about to transfer full control of his daughter's company into my hands without him realizing it. This isn't something I'm involved in, I said. It wasn't a lie, just not the version of the truth he expected. The call ended quickly after that, his tone shifting from controlled to frustrated in seconds. I set the phone down without thinking about it again, because the conversation that mattered wasn't happening there. It was happening in documents, in negotiations, in quiet decisions that would determine the future of something my family still believed belonged to them. By late afternoon, the response came in. The board had accepted the offer, not because they trusted the buyer, but because they didn't have another option. The terms were strict, the control clauses absolute, but the alternative was collapse. And in situations like that, survival outweighed pride every time. The acquisition was complete. Carter Holdings no longer existed as it had before. It now belonged to an entity without a face, without a public identity, without any visible connection to the Carter name, an entity I controlled entirely. The announcement was released the next morning. Private investment firm acquires Carter Holdings in $180 million deal, full restructuring planned. The headlines focused on the scale, the speed, the uncertainty. Analysts speculated about the buyer, naming firms, suggesting possibilities. None of them were right. Victoria's message came shortly after. They sold the company, she wrote. Can you believe that? After everything we built. I read it once, then again. There was no mention of the decisions that led to that moment. No acknowledgement of the data, the warnings, the consequences. Just disbelief. They're already talking about new leadership, she continued. I still have connections. I can get back in. I could see it clearly, the way she was reconstructing a future that no longer existed. You should be careful, I replied. Things have changed. It was the closest I came to a warning. She didn't take it as one. I know how this works, she said. They'll need someone with experience. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. Some realizations couldn't be given. They had to be walked into. I closed the message thread and turned back to the screen, where the first phase of restructuring had already begun. Departments were being evaluated, contracts reviewed, leadership positions marked for removal. At the center of it all was a decision I hadn't finalized yet. What to do with Victoria. I didn't rush it, because timing was part of control, and the most effective moves weren't the ones people expected. They were the ones that made everything clear, just a moment too late. The invitation was sent 3 days after the acquisition closed, timed precisely to land when uncertainty had started to turn into urgency. It wasn't labeled as an interview. It was framed as a leadership reassessment session, the kind of language that softened the reality without changing it. Everyone who received it understood what it meant. Victoria received hers at 8:12 a.m. I knew because I watched the confirmation logs update in real time. Her email was opened within seconds, followed by a pause that lasted just long enough to suggest she was reading it more than once, recalibrating her expectations. Then came the response. Confirmed. I'll be there. No hesitation, no doubt, just confidence. I studied her file again, not because I needed to, but because precision mattered. Her record looked exactly the way people liked it to look. Fast promotions, high visibility projects, consistent recognition. On paper, she was the kind of executive companies protected. But data didn't protect anyone. Beneath the surface, the patterns were clear. Risk decisions clustered under pressure, delayed corrections, a tendency to prioritize momentum over stability. Each point aligned with the trajectory that had led the company to collapse. I closed the file. Across the city, she was preparing in a different way. I didn't need to see it to understand it. The tailored suit, the controlled tone, the rehearsed explanations that would frame failure as complexity. She had always been good at that, at shaping perception until it felt like truth. And for a long time, it had worked. My phone lit up mid-morning. Her name. I answered. Claire, she said, her voice steady but tighter than usual. You've seen what's happening. Yes. They're restructuring everything, she continued. New ownership, new leadership. But they don't understand how the company actually runs. That's the problem. I didn't respond. They've asked me to come in, she added. To talk about my role, it makes sense. They need continuity. Someone who knows the system. There it was. The assumption. They'll need someone who can fix what went wrong, I said. That's exactly what I've been doing, she replied quickly. You know how this works. It's not about one decision. It's about the bigger picture. I let the silence settle for a moment. Good luck, I said. She paused, as if expecting something more. Agreement, support, recognition. When it didn't come, the call ended. By early afternoon, the building was ready. The transition had already begun under my direction. Security protocols updated, access levels redefined, internal systems adjusted to reflect a structure no one outside this level fully understood yet. The changes weren't obvious to outsiders, but they were absolute. I entered through a private access point, bypassing the main lobby entirely. The elevator moved without interruption, carrying me directly to the executive floor where the reassessment sessions were scheduled. Everything was in place, documents prepared, data verified, board members briefed. The process was designed to appear collaborative. It wasn't. From the live feed, I watched as candidates arrived one by one. Some carried confidence, some carried caution. All of them walked into a system that no longer responded to the assumptions they had built their careers on. Then Victoria arrived. She moved the same way she always had, controlled, intentional, aware of the space around her. Her expression was composed, her posture unchanged. If anything, the situation seemed to sharpen her focus. She approached the reception desk, exchanged a few words, then took a seat in the waiting area. From the outside, nothing about her suggested uncertainty. But small details told the truth. The way she adjusted her sleeve twice, the slight pause before she crossed her legs, the brief glance toward the elevators as if trying to map a space that no longer aligned with her expectations. She felt the shift. She just didn't understand it yet. Inside the conference room, I reviewed her file one last time, not out of doubt but out of discipline. Every detail mattered. Every conclusion needed to be grounded in something that couldn't be challenged. This wasn't about confrontation. It was about structure. A knock on the door. "Ready," my assistant said quietly. I closed the file. "Bring her in." Outside, Victoria stood as her name was called. She smoothed her jacket, lifted her chin slightly, and walked toward the door with the same certainty she had carried into every room for years. Because in her mind, this was still a process she understood, a conversation she could guide, a situation she could manage. She reached for the handle. And in that exact moment, before the door opened, everything she believed about control was still intact. It wouldn't be for long. The door opened, and the version of the room Victoria expected didn't exist. She stepped in with the same controlled confidence she had carried through every boardroom of her career. But it stopped halfway across the threshold, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough for the shift to register before she could correct it. I was already seated at the head of the table. For a moment, she didn't move. The board members remained still, their attention directed toward me, not her. No introductions were made, no repositioning of authority. The structure was already established before she entered. "Claire," she said, quieter than she intended, as if saying my name differently might change the context. I didn't respond immediately. There was no need to. "Please, have a seat," I said after a brief pause, my tone even, professional, detached from anything she might recognize as familiar. She stepped forward slowly, her eyes still fixed on me, recalculating. The confidence didn't disappear. It adjusted. She sat across from me, not beside, not equal, but positioned within a framework she hadn't been invited to define. A small detail. But it mattered. She glanced around the room, searching for alignment, for a signal that this was something she could navigate the way she always had. There was none. The board was neutral, observing, waiting. I opened the file in front of me. "Thank you for coming," I said. This session is part of the leadership reassessment following the acquisition. We'll be reviewing prior performance, decision frameworks, and suitability for future roles. The language was precise. It didn't invite negotiation. Victoria leaned forward slightly, regaining structure. I understand, she said. There are contextual factors around the recent decisions that should be considered. The situation was more complex than it appears. We'll address that, I said, redirecting without raising my voice. I turned the first page. Let's start with the Q2 expansion strategy, I said, specifically the secondary logistics acquisition. Her posture steadied. That was a calculated move, she replied. The projections supported. I rotated the document toward her, highlighted sections, financial breakdowns, internal risk assessments that had been flagged and ignored. These projections? I asked. She looked down, scanning quickly, then back up. Those numbers were based on the information available at the time, she said. Market conditions shifted. They did, I said, 3 weeks after your internal risk team identified exposure. I tapped the page lightly. Your signature is here. Silence. Not tense, not hostile, just exact. Victoria's eyes moved across the document again, slower now, more deliberate. The confidence in her expression didn't vanish, but it tightened, recalibrating under pressure she hadn't prepared for. That analysis wasn't conclusive, she said. We had to make a decision based on broader strategy. And the broader strategy, I said, turning to the next page, resulted in a 28% capital loss within the first quarter. I didn't emphasize the number. I didn't need to. Data, when presented without emotion, removed space for interpretation. She opened her mouth to respond, then stopped. For the first time, there was a delay. I continued. We're not here to assign blame, I said. We're here to assess alignment between decision-making patterns and the company's future direction. The statement reframed the entire room. Not accusation, evaluation. Victoria straightened slightly, pulling back control where she could. I've led teams through complex transitions before, she said. This wasn't a failure of leadership. It was a convergence of factors that... Leadership, I said quietly, is defined by how those factors are managed. The words landed without force, but they held. Another page, another pattern. Each one aligned with a consistency that didn't require interpretation. By the time we reached the final section, the structure of the conversation had shifted completely. This wasn't something she could steer. It was something she was being measured against, and she understood that now. I closed the file. Do you have anything you'd like to add? I asked. It was the first open question, the only one. She looked at me for a moment, longer than before. Not with anger, not yet, but with recognition. Because for the first time since she entered the room, she wasn't trying to control the outcome. She was trying to understand it. And in that space between what she believed and what was in front of her, something shifted. Not visibly, not dramatically, but in a way that couldn't be reversed. The version of control she had relied on for years no longer applied. The structure had changed, and this time she wasn't the one defining it. The door hadn't just opened, it had closed behind her. The silence after my question stretched just long enough to change the shape of the room. Victoria didn't rush to fill it. For the first time since she had walked in, she wasn't redirecting, reframing, or asserting control. She was thinking, carefully, measured in a way I had never seen from her before. Every decision I made, she said finally, her voice steady but quieter, was based on the information available at the time. You can analyze it now and call it a pattern, but that doesn't change the reality we were operating in. I let her finish, because this part mattered. I'm not questioning your intent, I said. I'm evaluating your impact. The distinction settled into the space between us, precise and unavoidable. I turned the final page of the report toward the board, not toward her. The data was already aligned. Loss distribution, decision timelines, risk exposure points, nothing exaggerated, nothing softened, just structure. This company, I continued, is entering a phase where it cannot absorb instability at the leadership level. The next stage requires consistency under pressure, not adaptation after failure. No one interrupted. They didn't need to. Victoria's gaze shifted briefly toward the board, searching for something familiar, some indication that she still had influence in the room. There was none. Their attention remained where it had been since the moment she walked in. With me. "So what happens now?" she asked. The question was direct, clear. For the first time, she wasn't trying to control the conversation. She was asking for the outcome. "We're restructuring leadership based on performance alignment with future operational requirements," I said. "Your previous role is no longer available." She held my gaze. "And a different role?" she asked. "Not defensive, not emotional, strategic." I shook my head slightly. "There isn't a position within the current structure that aligns with your profile and the company's immediate needs." The words were deliberate, final. For a moment, nothing moved. Victoria didn't react immediately. No visible shift, no outward resistance, just stillness. Then she leaned back slightly, her posture adjusting not in defeat but in recognition. "I see," she said. 2 words, but they carried more weight than anything she had said before. The board member to my left spoke next, his tone neutral, procedural. "Based on the presented analysis and current strategic direction, we support the CEO's recommendation." One by one, the others nodded. No discussion. No hesitation. The decision moved through the room with quiet certainty. Official. Irreversible. Victoria's eyes flickered at the word, CEO, not because she hadn't heard it, but because now it was attached to me in a way she could no longer reinterpret. "You knew," she said, her voice lower, more precise. Not a question, a realization. I didn't answer, because the answer didn't change anything. She looked down briefly, then back up, her expression no longer searching for advantage, but for clarity. And for the first time, she saw it. Not the version of me she had defined for years, the one that had always been there. "I didn't think," she began, then stopped. The sentence didn't need to be finished. I stood up, not for effect, because the meeting was over. "We'll have HR follow up with transition details," I said. "Thank you for your time." Professional, neutral, complete. The board members began gathering their materials, the room shifting back into motion as if something fundamental hadn't just changed. But it had. Victoria remained still for a moment longer, then stood, slowly, deliberately. She didn't look at the board. She didn't look at the documents. She looked at me. There was no anger in it, no accusation, just clarity. "You built this," she said. I met her gaze. "I rebuilt it," I replied. The correction was small, but exact. She nodded once, then turned and walked toward the door. No hesitation, no argument, no attempt to hold on to something that no longer existed. As the door closed behind her, the room returned to its original state. Controlled, functional, focused. But something had shifted. Not in the company. In the structure that had defined my family for years. Victoria had always been the center of it, the standard, the expectation, and I had been everything outside of that. Now those roles no longer existed, not reversed, removed. I closed the file in front of me, the motion quiet, deliberate. There was no satisfaction in it, no sense of victory, because this had never been about proving anything to her, or to them. It was about reaching a point where the decision could be made without hesitation, and now that it had been made, there was nothing left to say. 6 months later, the company no longer resembled the one Victoria had once led. The structure was sharper, cleaner, built on decisions that didn't rely on confidence alone. Systems had replaced assumptions, and every department operated with a clarity that made failure harder to hide and easier to prevent. From the outside, it looked like a turnaround story. From the inside, it felt like correction. I stood in my office early that morning, watching the city move beneath a pale Chicago sky. The same skyline that had framed that night at the party now reflected something quieter back at me. Not success in the way my family understood it, not recognition or applause, but something more stable. Control. A soft knock broke the silence. Quarterly results are finalized, my assistant said, placing a tablet on the desk. We've exceeded projections again. I glanced at the numbers. They aligned exactly where they should have. Growth without volatility, expansion without exposure, the kind of performance that didn't depend on luck. Schedule the board review, I said. She nodded and left, closing the door behind her with the same precision that now defined everything in this building. I sat down slowly, letting the quiet settle. It wasn't the kind of silence I used to carry, the kind that followed restraint or unspoken frustration. This was different, chosen, controlled, a space where decisions didn't need to be explained to anyone. My phone vibrated once on the desk, a message from Victoria. I hadn't heard from her since the meeting. I started consulting, she wrote. Small companies, nothing major yet, but I'm building something. I read it twice, not because it was complicated, but because of what wasn't there. No blame, no comparison, no attempt to rewrite what had happened. Just a beginning. I typed a response. Build it right this time. I paused, then sent it. That was all, because there was nothing left to correct, nothing left to prove. The version of our relationship that had existed before no longer applied. Not because something had been broken, but because something had finally been understood. We were no longer part of the same structure, and for the first time, that didn't feel like a loss. Later that afternoon, I walked through the lower floors without announcing my presence. Employees moved past me, focused on their work, unaware of the full extent of what had changed behind the systems they now relied on. I preferred it that way. Recognition had never been the point. Clarity had. As I stepped outside, the air felt lighter, sharper, more defined. I paused for a moment before reaching my car, letting the memory of that night surface briefly. The laughter, the words, the way I had walked out without responding. At the time, it might have looked like silence meant defeat. Now I understood something different. Silence wasn't weakness, it was distance. Distance from people who needed you to stay small so they could feel secure. Distance from expectations that were never designed for who you actually were. Distance from a version of yourself that existed only to make others comfortable. I opened the car door, then stopped, letting that thought settle completely. Because the truth wasn't complicated. I hadn't won by proving them wrong. I had won by no longer needing them to see me at all. And maybe that's the part that matters most. The moment when you stop asking for permission. The moment when your value no longer depends on recognition. The moment when silence stops being something you hide behind and becomes something you stand on. If you've ever been in a place where your effort was dismissed, where your role was defined by someone else, then you probably understand that shift better than anyone. So I want to ask you something. Have you ever had a moment where you realized you didn't need their approval anymore? Or a moment where staying silent turned out to be your strongest move? Share your story in the comments. I read every one of them, and those stories matter more than you think. And if this kind of story resonates with you, if you believe in quiet strength, in building something real without needing to announce it, then stay with this channel and subscribe. There are more stories like this coming, and I think you'll recognize parts of your own journey in them. Until next time, keep building, and let your results speak for you. This narrative is dramatized for storytelling impact.